Hello, my name is Andrew Clark. I'm a writer and publisher of local history books. I've worked on over a dozen books on the old pubs of the North East, and in this talk, I'll be sharing some of the photographs, adverts and stories I've collected on the pubs, brewers and beer of our region. For information on Gateshead, I'm grateful for the excellent work done by local author John Boothroyd. I'll start with this wonderful advertising trade card showing the Tyne Brewery in Newcastle from the late 1960s. There's a slogan on the bottom of the card that says, "Home of Newcastle Blue Star Beers." There's so much going on in this image. The old 1884 brewery is superimposed on this aerial view when the company dominated this part of Newcastle. St James's Park can be seen in the top right-hand corner. At this time, it had open terraces and not the massive all-seater stands of today. Newcastle Breweries was formed in 1890 when 5 local companies merged. One of these firms was John Barras & Co, and it is their 1884 brewery that can be seen. John Barras was originally a Gateshead company who bought their first premises there in 1770. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw massive expansion for the brewer, and in 1927 its most famous beer was first produced, Newcastle Brown Ale. It's advertised here as the one and only. After the Second World War, Newcastle breweries continued to grow. They acquired hundreds of pubs and took over a number of breweries and wine and spirit merchants. In 1960, a merger took place with Scottish Breweries to form Scottish and Newcastle. The company thrived for a further 45 years before the closure of the Tyne Brewery in 2005, and the site was later cleared. Today, Newcastle University Business School, Science Central, a hotel, shops, and student accommodation occupy the area. As a reminder of the old Tyne Brewery, there's this carved date stone that stands on the redeveloped site in Blue Star Square off St James's Boulevard. You can see established AD 1770, which refers to John Barras's company, and removed from Gateshead 1884 is the date when that brewer moved to Newcastle. One of the few buildings to survive is the old administration office that is now the Sandman Hotel overlooking St James's Park. On the side of the hotel is another reminder of its former past, the blue star on the top right-hand corner. An advert for Newcastle Breweries from 1938 with the slogan, "The beer is fine at the Blue Star sign." First introduced by the brewery in the 1920s, the Blue Star became a recognised symbol for pubs and beer in Newcastle and throughout the North East. These are 2 similar adverts from the 1930s, encouraging cyclists and walkers to call into Blue Star pubs for a timely pause or a wayside halt. Before the Second World War, walking and cycling holidays or day trips were very popular when few people had cars. Here we see a Blue Star and a Gateshead pub, the Claxton Hotel on Sunderland Road around 1960. And now the Wee Chief pub in Carlisle Street, Felling. As well as the Blue Star, it has the date 1907 on the building with a Wee Chief emblem. This was the date the pub was rebuilt. The pub is still open today, and thankfully its interesting exterior is intact. Although Newcastle Breweries is no more, you can still see Blue Stars on some pubs today. Here's the Wickham House on the corner of Rowling Road and Bensham Road, Gateshead, with the Blue Star on display. In fact, the pub has not 1 Blue Star, but 3. It's great that this symbol of the region's brewing heritage survives on a local pub. Scottish and Newcastle's most famous product is seen in this advert from the 1960s, when Newcastle Brown Ale was now available in cans. It was advertised as the ideal Christmas gift for North Country exiles. This iconic beer became one of the Northeast's greatest exports after it was first launched in 1927, although since the closure of the Tyne Brewery, it is now produced in North Yorkshire. The brand is owned by Heineken and is popular around the world, with breweries in Holland and America producing brown ale for the export market. It's been featured in a number of American television shows, and it's said to be a favourite of Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood. Another brand produced by the brewery was Newcastle Amber Ale, which was on sale until the late 1980s. This was a lighter ale than Newcastle Brown and was a diluted version of Exhibition. An advert from a football programme from the 1960s shows some of the other beers available from Scottish and Newcastle, including McEwan and Younger brands. William McEwan started brewing beer in Edinburgh in 1856. His firm later merged with another Scottish brewer, William Younger. After the further merger in 1960 with Newcastle Breweries, the company's top three brands were McEwan's Export, Younger's Tartan Special, and Newcastle Brown Ale. A slogan for the Younger beers was, "Get younger every day." A delivery of Harp Lager to the 3 Mile Inn on the Great North Road, Gosforth. Lager started to become popular in local pubs in the 1960s, and Harp was one of a number of brands introduced at that time. It was originally brewed by Guinness. Then a number of companies, including Scottish and Newcastle, joined forces to produce the lager. Harp is still brewed by Diageo, the name Guinness have traded under since 1997. Although the Tyne Brewery was demolished, there are a few reminders of the company still in Newcastle. Here we see Percy Street around 1900. The tall building centre right is the then newly built offices of Newcastle Breweries. A more recent view of Percy Street, the former brewery offices are now known as the Bruce Building. In 2015, it was redeveloped into apartments and offices. Before that, from the 1950s, it had been owned by King's College, then Newcastle University. The Newcastle Brewery's name can still be seen above the main door of the Bruce Building on Percy Street, and on the floor tiles on the inside of this door. An advert from Newcastle Breweries from 1948 aimed at a furnaceman. It says, "After a good day's work for Britain, that's when beer is best." This is one of a series of adverts by the brewery that targeted different trades. At this time, heavy industry and drinking, sometimes heavy as well, went hand in hand for some. Our next few photos show pubs with names taken from work. Here's the Forgehammer Inn on Scotswood Road, Newcastle. A number of pubs on this famous road had names that were linked to the nearby Armstrong Works. Armaments, amongst other things, were manufactured by Armstrongs, and local pubs such as the Rifle and the Gun took their names from this industry. Another pub on Scotswood Road was the Hydraulic Crane. For a time, it was known as Armstrong's Hydraulic Crane. It was said that Scotswood Road had a pub on every corner. A trade journal from just before the First World War listed 28 pubs on it. I live near Scotswood Road and drive along it all the time, and for me it is difficult to imagine how it once looked when it was a thriving community. Here's a Gateshead pub with an interesting name, the Painted Hammer, named after a hammer used for dressing stone. This photograph shows the pub around 1950. There were many links between pubs and work. In shipyard communities, pubs were often named after vessels, such as the Mauretania in Wallsend or the Turbinia in Walker. Next to the Neptune Yard in Walker was the Neptune Hotel. In mining communities, you would have names such as the Colliery Tavern, the Coal Wagon, or the Miners' Arms. And now some Gateshead breweries, starting with John Barras. He's an advert for the company's India Pale and Mild Ales. John Barras purchased his first brewery in 1770, and he was followed in the family business by his son, also called John. The Barras' name continued until the late 19th century, when the company moved to Bath Lane in Newcastle. In 1890, John Barras and Co. joined with 4 other companies to form Newcastle Breweries. Brown ale from Tucker's Turk's Head Brewery in Gateshead. The Turk's Head Brewery began operating in 1790. Isaac Tucker joined later. In the late 19th century, the brewery employed 100 men and had 40 horses. The entrance of Tucker's Turk's Head Brewery around 1950. 20 years later, the brewery was demolished, 3 years after it had been bought by Whitbread. Tucker's and the brewery of Barras were between the High Street and West Street in Gateshead. An advert for John Rowell's, who had their base on Gateshead High Street. They were the brewers of prize medal pale ales, importers of vintage and other wines, proprietors of the Grey Hen Scotch liqueur whisky, and manufacturers of table and medicinal waters. The company was founded in 1840, and for almost a century it expanded, taking over other companies in Gateshead and Swalwell. However, Rowell's was one of a number of companies that was bought by Newcastle Breweries in the 1950s, and their premises were demolished. Another well-known Northeast brewer was Vaux. Here's an advert for Vaux's Double Maxim Brown Ale from 1938. Today, a number of soft drinks are advertised for their energy-giving powers, but 80 years ago, this man's drink was promoted for its health-giving properties. Maxim Ale was first brewed in 1901 and named after the Maxim gun attachment that was commanded by Major Ernest Vaux of the Sunderland brewing family. You can see a gun on the label of this bottle in the advert. The ale's strength was increased in 1938 and it was renamed Double Maxim. You can see the prices at that time. Pints were 9p, half pints were 5p, and nips were 3p in this advert. Here's a Vaux pub in Gateshead, the Globe on Old Durham Road around 1950. Vaux did not have large signage advertising themselves like some breweries did, but you can see the small sign that says Vaux Ales. The Vaux family started brewing in Sunderland in the 1830s. The company built a major brewery in the centre of the town and acquired pubs throughout the northeast. The brewery survived until 1999. However, former directors formed the Double Maxim Beer Company to carry on brewing former brands. Now based in Hortonley Spring, the company produces traditional beers such as Samson, Ward's Best Bitter, and of course its namesake, Double Maxim. Another Vaux pub in Gateshead was the Swan in Sheriff Hill. Now no longer a pub, the building has been converted for residential use, a common fate for former pubs. I have many happy memories of drinking in the Swan in the 1990s, and in particular, many good New Year's Eves in this pub. A former Vaux pub still going strong today is the Percy Arms in Percy Street, Newcastle. This photograph dates from around 1939, when it was bought by Vaux and alterations were made. Like a number of Vaux pubs at this time, it had the distinctive tiled band around the building. The Tanner's Arms on the approach to Biker Bridge had similar tiling. Here we see the Percy Arms in more recent years. The tiling and other Vaux alterations have now gone. However, something has survived from a previous owner, and that's the weather vane on the roof of the building. That is a little bit of history from an old Newcastle brewer. Here's a close-up of the weather vane that has survived over 100 years of makeovers and changes in ownership. The initials are RC and F, standing for Ridley, Cutter and Firth, a Newcastle firm who had over a dozen pubs in the city. They were all acquired by Vaux in the 1930s. Have a look for the weather vane the next time you're in Percy Street. Another North East company was James Deuchar. He's an advert for their Lochside Export, a better bottled beer from 1951. Scottish-born James Deuchar came to the North East in the 1860s. At that time, the region was booming with coal mines and factories, and there was money to be made in selling beer to the men who worked in these industries. From humble beginnings, James Deuchar did well, and eventually owned a large number of pubs in Newcastle, Gateshead and Sunderland, as well as the Lochside Brewery in Montrose. The company's Scottish ales were brought to the North East by sea on 2 steamers, and it was said if the steamers came down in rough seas, the beer tasted better. The James Deuchar company survived until the 1950s, when it was bought by Newcastle Breweries. One of the many James Deuchar pubs was the Mulberry in Felling, seen here around 1950. Like many Deuchar pubs, their name was very prominent. There's also an advert for Lochside Ales. The pub is now being converted into housing. This is the Lochside pub on Red Hall Drive in Cochrane Park, Newcastle. The pub is still there today. It was opened just before James Deuchar's was taken over by Newcastle Breweries. So this is one of the last surviving reminders of the James Deuchar pub and brewing empire. One of the landlords of the Lochside pub in the 1970s was Bobby Mitchell, the former Newcastle United winger. Mitchell, known as Bobby Dazzler, was one of Newcastle's great players in the 1950s and helped the club win 3 FA Cups. Despite this success, he did not enjoy the financial rewards that footballers do today. Mitchell played during the era of the maximum wage, which lasted until 1961, when it was £20 a week. Although footballers were still better paid than the average worker, they were never given the rewards that today's stars receive. And so Mitchell and his teammates would need to find a new career when their playing days was over. Becoming a pub landlord was a popular choice for former footballers. As well as being at the Lochside, Bobby was also landlord for a time at the Cradlewell pub in Newcastle. A Newcastle Breweries advert congratulated Newcastle on winning the FA Cup for the 2nd time in a row in 1952. The cup was won for a 3rd time in 5 years in 1955, with Bobby Mitchell scoring one of the goals in the 3-1 victory against Manchester City. There were strong links between local breweries and football teams. Scottish and Newcastle sponsored Newcastle United for many years, with the Blue Star appearing on strips, while Vaux sponsored Sunderland in the 1980s and 90s. Another of the Deuchar clan was Robert, and here's a Robert Deuchar pub in Gateshead, the Black Bull on Mulgrave Terrace, seen here around 1910. As you can see, the Robert Deuchar name is much bigger than the name of the pub, and that was common for this company. Robert Deuchar started brewing at Sandyford in Newcastle in the late 19th century and quickly built up a portfolio of public houses. Also around this time, he bought the Duddingston Brewery outside of Edinburgh, and a number of their pubs advertised their celebrated or fine ales, as can be seen in this photograph. Another of Robert Deuchar's pubs in Gateshead was the Albert Inn, seen here in the 1950s. It was known as the Little Albert. There was also the Prince Albert and the Royal Albert. It was believed to be the smallest pub in Gateshead. Robert Deuchar's was taken over by Newcastle Breweries in the 1950s. The former premises of Robert Deuchar in Sandyford is still standing and has now been converted into flats. Robert Deuchar's name can still be seen above one of the doors of his old building. The final brewery I'll feature is the Federation. This is a postcard from the 1970s, taken from Gateshead looking towards Newcastle. To the left, you can see a flat roof building that was the Federation Brewery that stood in Hanover Square behind the central station. The Fed was established in 1919 when social and workingmen's clubs came together to form the Northern Clubs Federation to supply beer to their premises. In the early 1930s, the brewery in Hanover Square was acquired, and it was its home for 50 years before the Fed moved to Dunstan in the early 1980s. The Dunstan Brewery was a very modern plant. However, the 1980s were hard times for the North East clubs, with many closing over the following decades. In 2004, the Federation Brewery was sold to Scottish and Newcastle for over £7 million. The Fed now became the home of Newcastle Brown Ale. However, this new arrangement only lasted a few years, and the Federation Brewery was closed in 2010, and production of brown ale was moved to Yorkshire. Although I've talked about breweries that have now gone, the brewing industry in the North East is thriving, with many popular and award-winning companies in our region. So try some of their excellent beers the next time you see them in your local pub. Over the years, many old pubs have closed and been demolished, but they live on in old photographs and people's memories. However, some of the buildings have survived, and in the next selection of images, I'll show you what some of these former pubs became. Here's a wonderful postcard by Gibson of Gateshead that shows Windy Nook in the early 1900s. Gibson is one of my favourite postcard photographers, as he often included people in his pictures to show wonderful social history from over 100 years ago. On the left is the Black House pub. It's had an interesting history. It was once called the Coal Wagon, and around the time this photograph was taken, there was a bowling alley behind the pub. Over 100 years later, this is the scene at Windy Nook. It's now a busy crossroads controlled by traffic lights, and you can't stand in the middle of the road to have your photograph taken like the people in the previous image. The building of the Black House has survived, but it's now a Tesco Express. Converting pubs into shops is popular, in particular the smaller express type of the main supermarkets. Pubs are often in prime positions in the local community, so handy for shopping. They're also sturdy buildings, sometimes with car parks, and crucially, they have had licenses to sell alcohol, which can then be transferred when the pub has a new purpose. Here's the Hawthorne Inn on Forth Banks in Newcastle. The pub was behind the central station, and when this photograph was taken, it was a very industrial area. Today, the building has survived, but it's now a restaurant. The area around it has also changed, with a hotel towering above the former pub. Turning pubs into restaurants is another good alternative use for their buildings. Like shops, they're often in good positions with former licenses for alcohol. And the pubs may have served food themselves and have kitchens and lounges that can be converted for restaurant use. This is the Deuchar pub on Gateshead High Street. It closed in the 1970s and has had a number of tenants since then. Here it is a few years ago, when an energy company occupied the building. For many years, it was the home of the Auto Trader magazine, and their old sign can be seen on the building today as it stands empty. I worked for Auto Trader in the 1990s and didn't know at the time that the building had previously been a pub, as inside there was nothing left showing its former life. Pubs can have many uses after they close. 2 pubs in Jarrow have been converted into children's nurseries. This photograph shows the Grapes Vaults on Grey Street, Newcastle in the 1960s. Within 2 decades, this city centre pub was closed. And it later became part of the HSBC Bank seen here. Looking at this photograph, you would think the pub had never existed. There are several pubs in Newcastle that had formerly been banks, whereas this bank has done the opposite and taken over a pub. I'll end my talk with some pub tales. This is William Campbell, who was manager of the Duke of Wellington in High Bridge, Newcastle. He was born in Glasgow in 1856, and it was said that he weighed 52 stones when he died at the pub, aged only 22 years. He must have been an imposing figure behind the bar, as he was 6 foot 4 inches in height, with 96-inch shoulders and a 76-inch chest. This sketch shows the funeral of William Campbell. As you can see, the landlord's body had to be lowered from an upstairs window. Here's the Duke of Wellington in High Bridge in recent years. Not far from here is the Old George Inn, Newcastle's oldest pub. The George dates from the late 1500s and is still going strong today. A tank arrives in Crudders Park, Newcastle on the 1st of December 1969 for the opening of the Chieftain pub, which took its name from the tanks built at the nearby Vickers factory on Scotswood Road. An advert produced for the pub's opening night gave this description of its themed interior. The bar is a long alcove room with a floor covered by patterned lino whose design strongly resembles a tank track imprint. Photos in the bar depicting a cut-through interior of the Chieftain tank is used as a wall decoration opposite the counter. And to enhance further what can be safely described as unique is the counter front, which is decorated with solid black pads on a sandy background, reminiscent of the inset rubber pads used in the tank's Caterpillar tracks. The lounge, for a combination of eye appeal and ingenuity, takes some beating. Entering through a short curved passage, there is a scaled down low relief representation of the lower portion of the Chieftain tank, namely tank track and road wheels. This is a fiberglass reproduction mounted to the counter front. On the left of this tank is a small armoury of shells. Possibly the pub's principal feature, although it will be considered by many that every aspect is a special feature, is a 120mm gun, seen in profile, starkly silhouetted against a brightly lit camouflage background, forming the back to the lounge bar. And now some photographs of customers inside and outside of pubs. Here's a group of gentlemen and a dog outside the Crown on Coastworth Road, Gateshead, probably around 1920. It must have been a special occasion. They're nearly all wearing flowers in their buttonholes. So could it have been a wedding? Now another happy day, this time outside the Pineapple Inn, Elsick, on Sunday the 24th of May 1914. This group, including the local vicar, are ready to go on a trip to Wooler. It's likely that this was a men-only trip, and the children in the photo and the vicar were only posing for the photographer before seeing the men off. Sadly, a few months later, the First World War started, and I wonder how many in this photograph were involved in that conflict. And this is my final image. Happy times in the hydraulic crane on Scotswood Road in the 1960s. I know someone on this photograph, and she told me it was one New Year's Eve, as that was the only time she went to the pub with her parents, who were also in the picture. So I'll end on this memorable image. I hope my talk has brought back some memories of the pubs, brewers and beer that you remember. Thanks for listening. Take care and goodbye.